It's really with great pleasure that I introduce to you tonight Kemal Dervis, who is, as what we call in our jargon at the UN, the administrator of the UNDP. I hate the word. I hope you like it. But
what can't change it. Need a General Assembly resolution to change it.
Well, what it means is that he's at the head of UNDP, and this is the third highest ranking position official at the United Nations after the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General. It's a position he is appointed by the Secretary General, accepted and approved by the General Assembly for a period of 4 years. He's also the chair, and this is important, of the UN, what we call again in our jargon, the UNDG, which is really the development group at the United Nations, which is a committee with all the funds, programs, and departments of the United Nations dealing with the issue of development. And this is an important chair. I think you have always been dealing with development, as far as I can see, even when you were with the parliament in Istanbul, in Turkey. Kemal Dervis has been with the World Bank, has been with an innumerable amount of networks working on development, is now with the United Nations. He has written extensively about it, and his last book, which was published in 2005, which is called, I believe, A Better Globalization, is a book which is quite well known. He's traveling tonight. He's going somewhere else in the world. He's taking a plane after this panel. It's extraordinary that we can have him tonight. And it's the first panel that I ever organized at SIPA where I have only one speaker. So this is a compliment to UNDP and to Kemal Dervis. I want it to be a discussion between you and him. It's a fascinating subject. Development, obviously, it's an issue that the United Nations still considers as one of its priorities, but which has become very complex with the issue of climate change. So I give the floor to Kemal Dervis immediately. He has only till 7:45, and therefore you should really use your time for questions as much as you can. You have the floor.
Questions, I'll sit down. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I'm glad to be here. I was here, I think, about 1.5 years ago in a different context, but it's always good to be at SIPA and good to be in a university with lots of young people. What I wanted to do tonight, and after having talked to Elizabeth about how best to handle it, is give you some perspectives on the UN and development, stressing that development is one of the pillars of the UN, with security, peacekeeping, humanitarian affairs, and development. These are the major pillars. And share with you a little bit of my perspective on the history, how we got to the point we are at today, but also looking forward, of course, and what are the kind of key challenges for us as it stands today. From the beginning, the UN had a development dimension, and at the same time, I think it's important to remember that the World Bank and the IMF, although they are distant cousins, are also part of the UN family. So when we say the UN, there's always this little question mark. Do you include the Bretton Woods institutions or don't you? Well, strictly speaking, they are part of the UN family, but their governance and their structures are quite different. So sometimes one leaves them out, sometimes when they're in. There certainly is always a very close relationship. But I will kind of say that when I say the UN, I will exclude the World Bank and the IMF at this point, having stressed that there is a linkage, that World Bank and IMF officials do travel on UN passports, for example, which is sometimes not well known. And I will maybe get back a little bit to this relationship towards the end of my remarks. one of the key strengths of the UN, and there has been lots written about the intellectual history, has been that throughout the past decades, throughout the creation, the UN has had that extra legitimacy that comes from its universality, the fact that during the Cold War, when the world was split, the UN did not always have everybody, but always had the whole world, and always practiced the principle of universal presence. So while other institutions were perceived very often as partial, allies of one alliance or the other, I think one thing that I would like to stress is this kind of universality of the UN, the presence, and the fact that it wasn't taking sides in a sense. Okay, there were lots of debates, of course. The UN had strong views, UN organizations had strong views, but it was not perceived to be on one side of the great divide in the world, which was not true for the IMF and the World Bank, because the Soviet Union had pulled out of these institutions, had not participated. So in that sense, the IMF and the World Bank were always considered as, quote, Western institutions, whereas the UN was considered a more global and more universal type of organization. So I think that's one point that it's important to stress when we think of UN and development. And also when you look at the intellectual history, I would say that the UN, perhaps more than some other institutions, stressed always the social side, stressed the income distribution side, perhaps more than some of the other institutions. Now, having said that, I immediately want to say, of course, that when I say the UN and development, we're talking of many institutions. The United Nations Development Program is one of them, the largest development institutions within the UN family. But overall, I'm sure you know already from past discussions and from Elizabeth that the UN has 38 organizations that are part of the UN family. And I would say, depending on the topic, 20 to 25 of them are active in development. UNICEF is active in development, UNFPA is active in development, UNESCO deals with education and cultural issues, the ILO is active on labor market issues, so it is a family. UNDP's role is therefore a double role. It is a development agency itself, so UNDP has its own development programs around the world, but at the same time, UNDP also chairs what's called the United Nations Development Group, in other words, all the organizations that are active in development, and manages the resident coordinator system. We have 134 resident coordinators around the world in developing countries. They represent UNDP. They are the accredited representative of UNDP, but at the same time, they are also chairing what's called the UN country team on development, and that depends on the country. Sometimes there are 5, 6 organizations, sometimes there are 25 present in the UN country team. However, UNDP chairs. It has no line authority. Okay, so it's a chairing role. It's not as if UNDP was the boss of the other organizations or had any direct authority. It is a facilitating role, a chairing role, but it stops there. And there's a lot of debate, and we can get more into it if you like later on exactly how this works or doesn't work, because there are many things that are very difficult. When you do have an organization that is both an actor and an important actor, and at the same time chairs other actors, there is an inherent tension here. Some other actors are saying, how come you're chairing? Some actors are saying maybe the chairmanship should rotate among institutions. So there is this kind of debate, and we've had it for a long time. At the end of the day, however, for a long period now, there is consensus on the fact that UNDP should play that role, because UNDP mandate is more multi-sectoral, is less specifically sectoral than some others. It's not education or it's not health like WHO, it's overall development. So there is a certain logic, therefore, that the institution among all the organizations, which is the multi-sectoral one, which is trying to see the whole rather than parts of the whole, is also the one that should try to chair and try to coordinate the work. I was once talking to Bob Zoellick, the new president of the World Bank, trying to explain how this works. And he said, well, it's as if the World Bank, instead of having departments in one organization, in one very large organizations, had every department independent. And that must be tough, he said. And I said, yes, it is not, it's not that easy. But that, in a way, was the kind of comparison that came to his mind. We were trying, you know, we are independent organizations within a family where there's need for coordination, but where there's very little line authority. Now, again, I think it is instructive to make the comparison with the Bretton Woods institution, because it brings to light what are the kinds of things where the UN in development is particularly strong and where the competitive advantage is. I already mentioned there is this legitimacy and universality side of the UN, which is very important. I always tell the story that when I was in Turkish Parliament and the news came that Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General, had asked me to join UNDP, there was no problem in Turkey. People were happy. It was, you know, it was a positive thing. I mean, it wasn't, if it had been the IMF, it would have been a very different story, you know. So that it's an example of how the UN has kind of, I would say, very broad sympathy and is regarded as an organization that belongs to everybody. Now, it's true that the Turkish government has an executive director at the IMF's board also, and one could argue that it also is an owner of the IMF. Legally speaking, that's true. But try to explain that to public opinion would be very difficult. And I'm giving Turkey an example. It would be the same in Brazil or in South Africa or in Tanzania or wherever. The UN is felt to be much more owned by the whole international community than the financial institutions at Bretton Woods. That's one advantage. The second advantage, although I know I will immediately tell you that it also creates a little bit of a problem, is the link to early recovery, peacekeeping, post-conflict. Okay? The fact that the UN is involved, and you've heard about in this course a lot about it, I'm sure, and I saw the great exhibition you have downstairs on the first floor about peacekeeping, means that there is a direct connection within the UN family, although these are different departments. Obviously, UNDP is not involved in peacekeeping. But there is a close connection between the recovery from conflict and the early development, early recovery stage. Okay? So the fact that within the UN we have different parts of the family dealing both with the post-conflict situation and then the early recovery, I think gives the UN a particularly strong and important role in countries which are coming out of conflict, or in conflict where there is still conflict, but at the same time one wants to start working on development, on recovery, in many countries in Africa, in Asia, and in some countries in Latin America, as you know. The UN is much more present on the ground, is quicker to act on the development side, and comes in to almost together with the peacekeeping function. And that is a huge advantage, a very important role for the UN in places like East Timor or Haiti or, of course, Afghanistan and DRC Congo and many others, where there is still tension, political problems, there are still peacekeepers, and at the same time we work on development. By the way, in those countries, the Secretary General appoints a special representative, a more senior person than the normal UNDP resident representative, who then is the head of the whole UN family in that country, both the peacekeeping side, if you like, and the development and humanitarian side. However, this is something we're thinking about a lot, and it's a challenge. When the peacekeeping role is no longer perceived as truly neutral when the peacekeeping role takes on certain political connotations in the international scene, then a tension arises between the development and humanitarian side of the UN and the peacekeeping side. The whole message we always give, particularly on the development and humanitarian side, of course, is we are neutral. We're not a political actor. We're not supporting one side against the other. Okay? We, humanitarians, of course, are there to save lives immediately. Development workers of the UN are there to help capacity building and long-term development. The peacekeeping side of the UN, which in a sense has to report directly to the Security Council and is authorized by the Security Council, does of course sometimes take on political connotation. So while I have said that the close link between early recovery and peacekeeping is an advantage for the UN because we are linking up, we're closely there supporting one another in a sense, it also poses a special challenge. Because at times, in some quarters, it raises the issue, is the UN really neutral on the development side? To what extent is it dominated by the Security Council? Okay? So I want to share this dilemma with you. There's no easy answer. We can debate it a little bit more in the question and answer time. But it does pose a particular challenge for us. And it is something we need to manage in today's world with new divisions. Today we don't have the Cold War type divisions, but we have other types of divisions and political tensions in the world. And on the development side, we have to be careful to keep what is our biggest asset in a way historically, the neutrality and the fact that we're representing the whole global community and not one particular part of it. Having said, so that's one area, the kind of link to recovery. Now, let me stress two other important dimensions of the UN's development work in general. One is the aid coordination function. As you, I'm sure, are well aware, today there are large number of aid actors, bilaterals, multilaterals, and increasingly also private foundations and private actors. In fact, private money is becoming huge compared to what it was. It was negligible 10, 20 years ago. So another function that the UN plays, and particularly the UNDP plays as manager of the resident coordinator system, is trying to help coordinate the aid effort of a very fragmented international aid system. In many countries, I've met ministers or high-level civil servants who will tell me, you know, we've just received 3 missions and we're getting 4 missions tomorrow, and this week I've spent all my time meeting donor missions. And I don't have time to do my work in my ministry. It's a real problem in many countries, particularly smaller countries where capacities are more limited. It's not such a problem in a country like India, for example, or large countries. But in smaller countries, it's a huge problem. So here, apart from trying to coordinate the United Nations' own country team, the UNDP also plays an important role in trying to coordinate the donor community as a whole. Just for giving you a flavor of things, the donor community used to be the kind of Western countries and Japan. And when I used to travel, even 3 years ago, in many African countries, and we would have an evening, a dinner, a working dinner, hosted by the resident coordinator, there would be the ambassador of Sweden and of Denmark and of the UK and the US and the Japanese ambassador and so on. Now, there are new seats at that table. When I just went to West Africa, in every single working dinner, there was the Chinese ambassador also. And in one of them, there was the Indian ambassador present. So things are, you know, the donor community is having new important actors, and the UNDP tries to very much, of course, bring together the whole community, and also our Chinese partners, particularly in Africa, have become very, very important players in this whole aid coordination business. It is important because, you know, there's no market here. Sometimes people who have a very kind of market-oriented view of the world, which is fine, but, you know, these are public institutions. There is no functioning market. It's not as if you could leave it all to the market. And when it concerns these public agencies and public actions, there is therefore need for some kind of policy coordination and administrative coordination mechanism. For example, if every donor requires different format for the reporting, you know, the poor country receiving the assistance has to make different types of documents, aggregate numbers in a different way, following different timings. It becomes a nightmare. And therefore, under what is called the Paris Declaration, which was agreed to some years ago, generally the donor community is now trying to harmonize its procedures, trying to say, okay, we want to fit the country's own efforts and own reporting. We don't want a reporting for us specially, but the country should have reporting systems, and then we can all share that reporting system. That's, of course, the right way to approach this. That's the best way. We're not quite there yet. Donors are still have a long way to go before they truly coordinate, you know, their efforts. And particularly as newer and newer donors come along, this whole coordination and harmonization agenda becomes very, very complicated. But there are many new actors. I mentioned China and India, but since I'm from Turkey, I should also say that just 3 days ago, we had a special session with the Turkish aid organization at the United Nations, working with the high representatives for the least developed countries. And a country like Turkey, which is very much still a developing country, has now created a $50 million special fund for Africa. So you see the kind of number of donors. Eastern European countries are beginning to become much more active as part of their EU membership. There's a commitment actually to spend in the first phase 0.17% of GDP on foreign aid. So, you know, the number of actors is increasing all the time. The aid agenda and the aid coordination is, of course, one very important part of our work, of the UN in development and of UNDP in particular. But I should say that it is often presented as the only development agenda, when in fact there's another set of issues which is also very, very important and which is quite different from the aid agenda per se. And it was very interesting when former Secretary General Kofi Annan convened the high-level panel on reform in the on the development side of the UN. We had a group of about 15 high-level people from the whole world. And the middle-income country representatives in that group faced the question by some donor representatives saying, why do you really want the UN? I mean, there was a representative, President Ricardo Lagos from Chile was a member of the high-level panel. And, you know, a donor from Europe asked President Lagos, I mean, why do you want the UN in development in Chile? I mean, you don't need foreign assistance anymore. You don't get foreign assistance anymore. There's no point in having the UN in Chile. Okay? And of course, the answer to that question from all the middle-income countries was very emphatically, yes, we want the UN. But they don't want the UN in order to help coordinate aid or get minimal amount of funds in terms of grants. The middle-income countries stress the need for the UN to help them and interact with the UN in managing global public issues. That's what the role of the UN is, you know, the second role, if you like, of the UN. Apart from the aid coordination and aid facilitation role, there is this whole issue of global, what economists call global public goods. And here, the role of the UN is, of course, very important also in middle-income countries. Now, Nick Stern, who, as you know, prepared the important report on climate change, on the economics of climate change, commissioned by the UK government, gives the climate issue and the environmental issue, but particularly the climate issue as such, as a very good example of a global public good. There are different types of global public goods, but climate is, of course, very much a public good, in the sense that what we do here in Manhattan, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, or what people do in Berlin, affect global temperature in the long term the same way as what people do in Bangladesh or in Africa or in Brazil. The global heat trapping gases, as you know, aggregate themselves in the atmosphere and then affect the whole world. Now, it's true they don't affect everybody in the same way, but in terms of what we are doing here, affecting everybody else in the world, and what somebody else is doing somewhere else in the world affecting us, it is a very good example of what economists call externalities, or if you like, it's a particular type of global public good. So the second important role of the UN in a development context has to do with the management of global public goods. And this is not an issue of foreign aid, it's an issue of financing, managing aspects that have huge externalities, problems that affect humanity as a whole. Another example, avian flu. You know, the avian flu, if it mutates, if the virus mutates, and if it becomes a huge pandemic for the whole world, will affect everybody. So what happens in, let's say, Vietnam, in terms of protecting Vietnam from outbreaks of avian flu, culling the birds, compensating the farmers for the birds they lose, you can view it as partly a development in Vietnam type of activity because you're helping fight poverty in Vietnam. But at the same time, it also is, of course, a global public good provision, because if we manage as an international community, together with the Vietnamese government and Vietnamese society, to stop avian flu and to prevent the virus from spreading in Vietnam, at the same time, of course, this is of great benefit to the whole international community. So that's the second point I wanted to stress here, that it's not just an issue of foreign aid, but it's also an issue of managing global public goods. Both of these aspects, the foreign aid aspect and the global issues aspect, is embodied in the Millennium Development Goals, which I'm sure you all know were adopted by the summit, the General Assembly at leaders level in the year 2000 at the turn of the century, and in a way put forward a set of goals which have both to do with poverty reduction but also with the management of global issues such as the environment, and which the whole international community accepted as operational targets to be achieved by 2015. But there are both these aspects, the global public goods aspect and the development aid aspect in that overall framework of the Millennium Development Goals. Now, to give you an example of the importance of the second aspect, the global public goods aspect, I'm going to perhaps give you some flavor of the debates around climate change in relation to development. I was in Bangladesh and in India just last week, two countries which are extremely important in this whole debate. Bangladesh, because it will be affected extremely strongly by climate change. Being a very low-lying country, if there's sea level rise, Bangladesh will be one of the countries most affected by climate change. In a very unfair way, because Bangladesh has contributed very, very little to the accumulation of heat-trapping gases. It's a good example of, you know, the rich countries, in a sense, maybe inadvertently, not knowing. I mean, the rich countries were not trying to change the climate, but, you know, the rich country activity generated the stock of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, and now if this continues, the impact will fall much more on countries in the lower latitudes, and Bangladesh is a good example of that. India is another interesting case in this whole debate, because it too will be affected by climate change, of course. But it's very big. It's huge, and its economy is growing very rapidly. So now there's a demand coming from the rich countries telling India, you have to now also start mitigating and putting limits on your greenhouse gas emissions. The Indian reaction to that is, wait a minute. As India, we are emitting 1.5 tons per capita of CO2. The US is emitting 21 tons, 1.5, 21. Europe average is 8.5. Russia is emitting about 11. So India is saying, first we have to develop, then you can ask us about, I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but then we can start worrying about these things. At the same time, it is true that if India keeps increasing its emissions at a very rapid rate, although its emissions per capita are still very low, because of its size, it will become a major contributor to climate change, as China, of course, already is. China is now about equal to the US in terms of global total emissions into the atmosphere. In per capita terms, of course, China is still very low. It's 4 tons. It's higher than India's 1.5, but it is 4 tons. So these issues have to be sorted out. These issues have to be managed, and cooperative solutions have to be arrived at, and financing has to support these cooperative solutions. And here again is one of the essential challenges and jobs the UN development system has to do. Now, coming back again on kind of how to think about this, one example I like to give is the following. Suppose India, and India needs energy. Hundreds of millions of Indians still have no access to electricity. Okay, so absolutely India must invest in a huge way in electricity generation, power generation. It has to build up its distribution of power capacity. It has to allow its people to have access to that energy, okay? If it uses old coal technology, and India is very rich in coal deposits, then this will create a huge problem for climate, cumulatively over time. If, on the other hand, it can use new technologies, clean coal technologies, technologies that capture carbon, which are not yet fully developed, but which are being developed, then it could engage in these huge infrastructure investments and huge augmentation of access to power that its population needs, but which with much less or very minimal effect on climate. However, it costs more. I'm just giving you an order. I mean, this is not an exact example, but think of a huge power plant that costs $500 million if it uses the old technology, okay? And then compare it to a power plant that uses more expensive new technology with carbon capture that maybe costs $600 million, okay? Now, the extra $100 million, we believe at the UN, should be borne by the international community, not India. The $500 million, yes, India itself can invest in it and pay out of its own resources. But the extra $100 million that will make sure that this power plant does not contribute significantly to climate change is something the whole world will benefit from, not just India. We will benefit living here, you know, in the US. I mean, maybe not us, but our children will benefit from it, our grandchildren. Bangladesh will benefit from it. So it would seem fair that that extra cost for this global public good be provided by an international financing mechanism, and not, the burden shouldn't be placed on the developing countries themselves. The same you can think of in other areas, in health areas, you know. Helping a country fighting highly infectious diseases is good for that country, and some of the cost and some of the, if you like, the resources have to be provided maybe by the country itself. But because of these global benefits, some of these benefits must be financed by the international community. So this is, if you like, the second big challenge for the United Nations system. How to organize this, how to get international agreements so that it can work, what kind of financing mechanisms to create, and then, of course, who bears the burden, how to kind of distribute that burden. As you know, the Secretary General called a high-level meeting in last September on climate issues, which was very well attended, and has taken a strong lead on these climate issues with us, of course, UNDP and others, UNEP and other UN organizations strongly supporting that effort. But we are still only at the very beginning in terms of, generating the kinds of solutions I'm talking about. And one thing that UNDP is very worried about, I think rightly and generally the UN family is very worried about, is that this very big, new, important, and very legitimate, and climate agenda is not seen as competitive to the poverty reduction agenda. That somehow we don't get into a situation now where people say, "Oh, okay, climate is now the big issue. Poverty reduction, well, yes, of course, important, but let's shift our resources to climate issues, kind of away from poverty reduction." So what we're trying very hard to do is to say that these two things should not be seen as competing agendas for the international community, poverty reduction and climate, but should be mutually complementary, and we shouldn't have a kind of poverty reduction track and a climate track separately, but we should have all this together in a sustainable development framework, which is something, of course, the UN has been championing even before the whole climate debate. This is a very, very important issue because the resources needed are huge. To give you a kind of order of magnitude, total development assistance is roughly $100 billion a year. With the devaluation of the dollar now, maybe it will go up to 120 in dollar terms, but in real terms, sometimes when you look at the dollar figures, they grow, but then you realize that part of it is the dollar losing its value. So we have to be careful how we measure these things, okay? When we measure them just in dollars, you get very confusing, misleading results. But roughly, let's say we have about $100 billion going in official development assistance. The estimates we have that for the Millennium Development Goals, excluding the climate issue, we should have at least 150. I mean, of course, the University of Columbia Earth Institute under the leadership of Jeff Sachs is doing a lot of work here. And we know that the 100 billion are not enough, even if the countries do the right thing. And I'm not saying that money is everything that counts, but we need more than $100 billion for the traditional Millennium Development Goals agenda and poverty reduction agenda. On top of that now comes the climate challenge, which wasn't so well understood 5-10 years ago. It's much better understood now. And very roughly, it is estimated that the needs related to climate adaptation and helping developing countries with clean technologies and things of that sort are probably going to be roughly in the order of $50 to $100 billion. So, it's not quite doubling, but it's a very significant increase in the overall public resources that are needed to do both the poverty reduction and the global public goods type of agenda. There is a huge resource shortfall, a huge resource problem, and this is one of the day-to-day worries we have, of course, that the resources just aren't enough. Now, of course, there's always, everybody needs more resources, and when I'm asked, how can you argue for that kind of augmentation of resources, I keep reminding people of the global military expenditures, which are in the order of, which are higher than $1 trillion, okay? And I ask people, even in the military, I say, do you really need another 100 fighter jets or tanks or anything like that? Because when I look around the world, and when I see the kinds of threats we face, even from a purely security point of view, terrorism, that kind of threat, I don't see that adding a huge amount of hardware really helps. I think solving some of the social problems, development problems in those countries probably, to me, would constitute a greater contribution even from a purely security point of view. I mean, forget about poverty, forget about climate, just security, than having another 100 airplanes. They don't seem to really work very well these days when you look at the country, you know, conflicts around. I'm not sure that adding another 100 planes in some of these areas where there's fighting will help. The real issue may be intelligence, maybe, you know, maybe counterterrorism, or maybe development, but not a lot of military hardware. Of course, there are not that many corporations that make big profits out of the development agenda, whereas military hardware is still something that provides a lot of profit to a lot of corporations, let's face it. So I think there's a political economy side here. But I don't buy the argument that somehow the world cannot come up with the extra 100 billion, 150 billion that's needed in a world with, you know, a $70 trillion kind of world economy these days, and the defense expenditures that are well above 1 trillion. Having said that, I do want to say, however, also, that as an economist and as somebody involved in policy for most of my life, I also do know that throwing money at problems alone is not the solution. It would not, I mean, it doesn't reflect my conviction or UNDP's conviction that just adding money is the solution. Money is needed, resources are needed. I gave you the example of the Indian coal-fired power plant, for example. I could give you the example of agricultural extension needs or irrigation needs in Africa, or many other things. But it is also true that these resources have to be combined with appropriate policies, with the right kinds of policies that allow these resources to be productive, and indeed allow the resources that are invested by the countries themselves to be productive. So what we do need to succeed in development clearly is resources and the right kind of policies. And here, maybe this comes now to I'm moving towards the end of my remarks, there is this big debate on conditionality. In other words, should resources be given with conditions attached that somehow try to determine, you know, the kinds of policies that should be implemented? It's a big debate. The model of conditionality used, for example, by the IMF is one particular type of model. The other, where it's very conditional, the resources are used with, you know, provided that the country does this, that, and the other. The UN approach is always very much, we help the country, but there's no explicit conditionality except broad accountability conditions. In other words, conditions where at least there's transparency in how the money is used. Okay, obviously we don't want the money to disappear into corrupt channels. Okay, but in terms of trying to tell countries exactly what policy to follow, the UN is taking much more of a hands-off approach and basically saying countries should develop their own policies. They should. We are happy to share our experience. We're happy to organize exchange between countries. What has worked well in one country may be interesting for another one. But we don't have programs that are conditioned on particular policies that we somehow advocate. Okay? In Brazil, President Lula's poverty reduction programs and conditional cash grants, conditional upon children being immunized, families doing, doing certain things in terms of education for their kids and so on, is working reasonably well. So, for example, we were very happy to try to bring the experience of Brazil to the attention of others, just as an example. But we will not, in a sense, say, okay, unless you have these kinds of policies, we will not provide development cooperation to you. That is against the basic principles of the approach of the UN to development. Sounds reasonable. I'm supporting this. I'm a strong believer that policies have to be driven nationally. But of course, there are gray areas. One has to be honestly say that there are gray areas. In a country which is extremely authoritarian, dictatorship, that sometimes you feel that it doesn't really have the interests of its own people very much in mind, would seem, okay? Where do we draw the line? You know, where do we say, okay, you know, country-driven, nationally determined strategies, but there are certain standards, certain basic standards that should be enforced or should at least be followed, okay? So I'm just flagging to you that there are gray areas and there are sometimes difficulties with this principle of total commitment to country ownership. I think I come out very strongly in favor of it. In the end, I don't think that policies that are imposed from abroad really work, although I do believe lessons from abroad are very important, and knowledge sharing in the world is very important. So on the whole, I strongly support, as chair of the UNDG, a country-driven, nationally driven approach. But at the same time, I must say there are some cases where the policies and the behavior of the authorities are such that it does become somewhat difficult to claim that within that kind of environment, the resources that are provided by the international community can be effectively used. So I don't want to brush away the problem as if it didn't exist. Here again, I think in this whole policy debate, it is very, very important that the UN remain politically neutral. Best practice, commitment, of course, to human rights and to the principles of the Charter, but not, or let me say, never be perceived or act as if you were instrumentalized by a particular country or particular group of countries. The preservation of the UN standing for the whole international community, not for a particular group or particular power, is extremely important because it makes our policy advice and our policy debate extremely effective. In many countries, I met policymakers, national leaders or partners, civil society leaders and so on, who will tell me, you know, we prefer the UNDP because the UNDP is not representing a particular interest. The UNDP stands for the whole international community, and we feel it. So that perception and that projection is very important in substance, in the way we act, in the way we balance our staff, in the kind of nationality mix we have. You know, all these things are very important to ensure and to kind of support the perception of countries that we indeed stand for universality and the legitimacy of the whole international community and not one particular group or one particular alliance. It does lead to some tensions sometimes. There are always pressures on us in various parts of the world, but I think we have to withstand these pressures and stand, yes, the principles of the Charter, basic human rights, of course, but not becoming a political actor or acting in favor of one group or another. In the day-to-day management of UN development affairs, this is a challenge. It's not easy. We live in the real world. Countries, small and big, have their interests in mind, and they are our bosses at the end of the day. You know, the member states, the General Assembly, the Security Council. It's not as if the UN had its own source of power. Our influence, our resources come, after all, from the international community as a whole. But I think because we have the international community as a whole, we can push, or we can promote, if you like, this universalist, inclusive model of international cooperation and try to always convince our member states that this is in the long-term best interests of the whole international community. And maybe this is where I would like to end, because at the end of the day, you know, I've also worked in the World Bank. I worked in my own country, of course, in national governments. Globalization requires a degree of global cooperation, international cooperation, global governance that does go beyond the sovereignty of individual nations. Some of these issues have to be solved in an international setting. Okay? And yet, at the same time, the world is still very much organized around 192 member states which are sovereign nations. The legitimacy of many of our decisions, of many of our governance mechanisms, is derived from the legitimacy of the individual sovereign national governments. There is no international source of sovereignty. The Secretary General is elected, is designated by the Security Council and then elected by the General Assembly. I myself, nominated by the Secretary General, but then again elected by the General Assembly. The General Assembly are an assembly of sovereign nation states. So we constantly in the international system, and those of you who will one day in one form or other join it, I don't think it will change that much that quickly. There is this fundamental legal fact that the legality comes from the nation states, okay? And at the same time, there is the need to transcend the nation state in some of the ways we organize cooperation on global issues, that there is something more than the nation state in the 21st century. You know, there is something more. But how to define it? What really is it? Where is its legitimacy? How can we appeal to the international community as a whole, or humanity as a whole, if you like, sometimes? When nation states, quote, misbehave, it's a very tricky issue. Where does our legitimacy come from? Very quickly, nation state will ask, well, who are you to tell us? Okay, and I think they have a point. And at the same time, I think we all feel that the nation state is somewhat, how shall I put it, is insufficient as a construct to deal with many, many of the global issues, and particularly the development issues that we face. So these are some of the perspectives I wanted to share with you, and I'll be happy. Elizabeth, it's up to you to determine the question time and all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this insightful, provocative presentation. I would like immediately to, in a way, start the debate by asking you, Kemal, to perhaps make one comment or a further comment about what you said, because I think you touched something which is really at the heart of the United Nations, which is this issue of impartiality, of perception to be at the service of the common good, versus the IMF, the World Bank, which is more perceived as a Western instrument, and so on and so on. So my question to you is, why is it that Lakhdar Brahimi just now is chairing a panel on the security of staff? Why is it that our flag doesn't protect us anymore? Why is it that your office, UNDP, has been attacked in Alger, as you know? And I can see Ghassan in the room, who was in Iraq when Sergio de Mello was killed. And how do we ensure that impartiality that you are talking about, when we are perceived by 2/3 of the world as being an instrument of a major member state? And in a way, as a soft target, we are receiving the hostility towards that member state. And I wanted to know how much it has complicated your work, the work of the humanitarian people in UNDP, because I can imagine that you must be looking at this issue of security for humanitarian workers. You were talking about the relationship between peacekeeping and UNDP. I know that it has endangered our peacekeepers as well. So if you could comment on this, because I feel that this question of impartiality of the UN, of the good guy of the UN, is being eroded in a way in the post-11 political framework in which we are operating. And I wonder if you could say something about this.
Well, it's, you know, the Algiers attack was, of course, a major shock. The Baghdad event was terrible also, and you know, Sergio de Mello, as you know, was one of the leaders of the UN, that one of the best leaders, most admired leaders of the system. But maybe one could say somehow that Iraq is a little bit special, that, you know, it's, I mean, there's kind of a war on, and so one, you know, one could kind of put it in a parenthesis maybe. But, you know, when it happened in Algiers and 17 UN staff were killed, it's not a, I mean, it's a major thing, and, you know. Then, of course, you wonder where, you know, this is a much wider problem also. There have been not minor, but there have been other attacks around the world, but not 17 people killed in one go in the office. So there is a, we are still under the shock of that attack, quite honestly. I was there the day after, and, you know, it was very, very, very sad. Of course, one has to also say that there are some extreme groups in the world which, no matter what you do, you could be attacked. So I don't want to fall into the trap of saying, you know, we could be protected if this and that. There are some people, some real extremists who, you know, who constitute a danger, and pretty much anything you do, you know, they would still constitute a danger. And it's not possible really to appease them. But what Elizabeth said is also true. The kind of sympathy they can generate, you know, is much greater if we cannot be sure to send the message that we are indeed politically neutral, that we indeed represent the whole international community, and that the blue flag of the United Nations is just that. It's the whole humanities flag. It's not the flag of one particular group or another. Okay. Again, I'm not saying, you know, even if we gave that message in the most perfect way, there will be some crazy persons who might do anything, you know. So we can't really, you know, we can't really avoid that. Okay. But I do believe that we must do more to make sure that that blue flag really does represent the whole of humanity. And here, I really do believe that Security Council reform, and this is not my topic today, I don't know whether you had a special session already on it, probably. But, you know, Security Council reform is important. I mean, we talk about the UN being more universal and all that, and we compare it in favorable terms to the Bretton Woods institutions, saying that they're more Western dominated and all that. But then there's the Security Council, you know, which is a problem, because it does reflect the world of 1945, basically. And, you know, I mean, I'm, again, as an official here, and I always have to be careful in academic environment, I sometimes go further than I should. But, you know, I can see no reason why a country of 1.1 billion people, which is a democracy, you know, should not be there, and small European country, you know, is there, because it 50 years ago won the Second World War, you know, or was a colonial empire, but in the meantime lost all its colonies. So there is something wrong here, and and it's terribly difficult to change, because, as you know, the existing powers have the veto right. So how do you change that? Because, you know, and yet I don't think we can survive much longer in terms of our effectiveness, the really effective United Nations, without having a Security Council that is much more representative of the 21st century world. Now, how to get there, it's not our topic tonight. But I do believe that, you know, this is really quite important. And it's true that when I had written the book, my book has a proposal on this, but I wrote it before I became UNDP, head of UNDP. So it's an academic proposal, so to speak, you know. My proposal was that somehow there should be weighted voting, with the weights representing population, GDP, and contributions to peacekeeping and to the financing of global public goods in a way, you know. And that somehow some kind of system of that sort, as an academic thought, not an official thought, was something worth debating. So I think, Elizabeth, there is this need for having a governance structure, because at the end of the day, governance is important. You know, governance is important. And if we had a Security Council that really was recognized by the citizens of the world, by the people, you know, in the world as, okay, that Security Council, okay, it's not perfect, but it does represent us. It does represent the realities of the 21st century. I think we would have a much better chance of kind of re-establishing this perception that we do indeed represent the whole of humanity.
I will now open the floor to questions. We have about half an hour where you can ask questions and have an interaction with Kemal Dervis. So please come to the microphone, introduce yourself, and form a line so that we go one after the other. So who goes first?
Okay. Can you hear me? I have a brief comment rather than a question to your idea about the clean plants. What I believe about the clean plants, right?
Yeah.
I think that this is the time when we have to think about things which are directed into our future. Because the plants you mentioned and you talked about, they are really something which belong to the future. It's not the yesterday. It is the future. It is the tomorrow thing. And we are going to face it. And I think that even we have to invest more today, a little bit more, not much. But in the end of the day, we have to understand that the clean plants, they are the technologies of the tomorrow. And I will give you a brief example, and to the rest of the audience here, that today the rich people, for example, buy not the huge makes, huge cars, which used to be very fuel consuming, right, but very dirty, which brought a lot for the damage of the environment. And now, even being really rich, they have the understanding that it is better still to, for the common good, again, which you mentioned, to buy something which has its own new technology, which is enough.
Excuse me, what is your question?
Yeah, it's not the question, it's a comment. Yeah,
okay.
It is better to buy something which is good for the common good and which is enough for the owner of that car. Thanks.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. It's Rhonda Haubin, and I both report about the UN, but I also take a course here. And I have a particular question about impartiality, and that is, what's your response to what happened with North Korea in the UNDP in January 2007, just as soon as the new Secretary General took over? And then the Wall Street Journal has a big article with many allegations, very little evidence presented. And then the UNDP executive board meeting is happening just at that time, so it was a very political time. And then the UNDP program wasn't then cut out, but it was subsequently as a result of all of this cut. And so what is the implications of that for the rest of what happens in the UNDP? And is there any way to deal with political activity going on against a program in a country, even if there may be problems, as I'm sure there are in many countries? So the UN, the Security Council spilling over into what happens in the UNDP.
Maybe I could
Do you
take
want to
two or
take
three.
two or three questions? Yes. Okay.
Hi, my name is Leif Holmberg. I'm a student here at SIPA. First of all, I would like you to feel very free in this academic environment, Mr. Dervis, to express your opinions freely. I mean, I'm sure all of us will keep everything you say in this room.
Including the video camera there?
Yes, that's just the interior thing. Anyway, I was working at the UN this summer, and I was following the executive board meeting, which was very exciting in regard to your strategic plan. Because, you know, it was a bit of political dynamics. And, of course, for somebody that's new, it was fun that my meetings were exciting and there was a political debate that was strong. However, I find it a little bit less exciting now than when I understand correctly there's no strategic plan yet adopted for UNDP. And that is more problematic. And therefore, my question is in regard to conditionality. And if I interpret what you said, you seem to say that the national ownership is the most important. So should one interpret that you think that it is for the Western countries to take a step back in regard to how the human rights issue is pushed in the executive board in terms of the strategic plan? And I would like you to elaborate a little bit about this issue of the strategic plan, because I think that's a policy issue that is really crucial in order to see where this is going today with the issue of development and human rights and this intersection and so on. Thank you.
One more and then, or maybe two more and then, yeah.
Swati Save. I'm a student at the Climate and Society program, getting trained in understanding climate change. So a very thank you for your intervention today and your point about Security Council, Iraq, and other major geopolitical dynamics over here. I had many questions, but I'm going to maybe have one important one. How would European Union look with Turkey's inclusion in it?
Oh, I see. All right. Maybe I'll take the three, because otherwise it gets too much. So if you can just wait. Okay, great. On the North Korea issue, some of the practices that the North Korean government insisted on were really practices which had been abandoned everywhere else in the world. For example, we hire our staff directly, we conduct interviews. The North Korean government still insisted on having basically government employees detached to our office in North Korea. This was, by the way, the case in many countries, in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, in many other countries it was the case. But all these countries abandoned that practice. North Korea kept insisting on it. So there were some other things in terms of, not many things, but for example, in terms of the way payments were made. Of course, it's a very messy situation because the exchange rate really doesn't mean very much. So actually, it's much better to pay. It's more transparent in a way to pay in an international currency such as the euro. But this is not something we like to do. In general, we like to pay in domestic currencies. So there were these issues. We discussed these, we brought them to the executive board, and the executive board decided that we should not continue these practices which were unique to North Korea at this point. Once the executive board had made that decision, we had no more choice. We had to, that this was an executive board decision, we could not argue with it, and therefore we had to close the office in North Korea. I have to add, however, that many other organizations are still continuing the same practices, including UN organizations, but certainly embassies also, because that's the way it is. And somehow this was focused on UNDP. So I've always said that I found it a little bit strange why UNDP was singled out in this case. Anyway, be that as it may, we also commissioned a independent international review headed by the former Prime Minister of Hungary, who will look into all of this and come up with a report that hopefully will shed complete light on what did happen or didn't happen and so on. But once the executive board makes a decision, of course, then we it is our governance structure, and whatever the governance structure decides, we have to follow. On the strategic plan, which is the kind of 4-year vision of UNDP, there was a lot of debate, and part of the debate focused on the human rights kind of approach. Now, UNDP is known to put human development for the last 2 decades at the center of its development strategy. I mean, we're not in the business of just measuring GDP, or we're trying to have a much more holistic view of development, which includes, the whole issue of human empowerment and human development. Some call it the human rights-based approach to development. So this is a long-standing UNDP tradition, okay, and I think we have a lot of support for that. Where the confusion, I think, arose is in some of the language that sounded very much like conditionality in an early draft of the strategic plan. And I think that was a mistake made by us, made by UNDP. We should not have had that particular language in the strategic plan. Because, as I said, our approach is to build capacity. It's to help countries implement human development-oriented and human rights-oriented policies, to help strengthen the judiciary, to help the police force behave better in many countries, you know, including the richest countries. Police sometimes behave in a not totally correct way. So, but the approach is we want to help building capacity. We're not a policeman. We're not going to go around countries and say, you know, you've somehow failed to do this or you failed to do that. That is not our approach to development and shouldn't be. And I think we have to make that distinction. So on the one hand, yes, we say we are going to concentrate on issues relating to human empowerment and human rights and give a lot of emphasis to the capacity building in these areas. But that's not the same as to say that we're going to run around trying to grade countries on human rights or trying to enforce a particular way of dealing with human rights issues. So I hope that this way of looking at it, you know, now has the support of the board. The strategic plan was actually accepted by the board in January, subject to revisiting some of these issues in greater detail in June and September. So we have an ongoing, if you like, dialogue on that. But I do believe that the emphasis on capacity development, the emphasis on, you know, helping the country build its capacity rather than the controlling type of approach is the right way to do it, frankly. And it's the only way the UN, I think, can legitimately do that. Now, as I said, there may be some extreme cases where our board decides, well, you know, in this particular case, the basic values of the UN Charter are being violated, and then, of course, you know, that's a different story. Now, I can't really, you know, in a UN capacity, speak exactly on Turkey and the European Union, although it is very close to my heart. But I do want to share with you that the former Secretary General Kofi Annan and now Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has continued to work on this, have, with the sponsorship of the government of Spain and the government of Turkey, have this initiative on the Alliance of Civilizations. And, you know, there is a lot of work going on, which I think very good work, that says that we are in that we have to bring different cultures, civilizations, and traditions together and not divide on religious or other grounds. And I do believe that within this whole debate European context, I think that approach is very valid, is very useful. There was a big meeting in Madrid in January, attended by many, many heads of state, including the Prime Minister of Turkey and the Prime Minister of Spain, hosting this whole event. So that's how I would like to, you know, deal with the European question. It's an issue that at the end of the day has to be resolved within the European framework. But clearly, divisions on the basis of, for example, religion would be very problematic for the whole global cooperation issue, way beyond the European issue. All right, I'll take the next.
You've raised important principles, especially the principle of neutrality, of the difficulty the UN is having because of the appearance that it may be somehow dominated by a single superpower. I thought the North Korean case is particularly important. I'm also reminded of the IAEA board, which took the Iran case and put it in the Security Council, making it more difficult to resolve from my point of view. Is there a problem that the boards are too close to the Security Council? Is there another contradiction buried in? Who is it that argues the principles to the board? Clearly, I don't think you're happy, or I wouldn't be happy, that a program couldn't be in North Korea. And so to have to withdraw from, because the board makes that decision, must leave this appearance of political something in the back, and therefore leads to this perception that the bodies of the UN are not neutral.
Can I ask you to quickly introduce yourself when you ask your question, and to make your question very short, because there is a long line, and Kemal Dervis has to leave at 7:45. So,
I'm Jay Halbin, and I work in the libraries here.
okay. Shall we take another question?
Yeah.
My name is Lucia Cannon, and I am an alumni of SIPA and of graduate faculties. And I wanted to ask a question about, maybe ask you to give more details about your proposal for this, that you made about that the Western countries should pay for projects which reduce emissions and climate change in less developed countries. Because I worked on energy projects actually in India and in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And one problem with India, you know, we had a situation where Enron built a very modern, super clean plant, and essentially the situation was where the Indian consumers didn't pay their bills, and the government did not force them to pay the bills. And therefore the company went out of business. And this is a very common problem in all the South Asian countries, and especially the groups that are powerful,
Short
the
question,
Pakistani
please.
military and, you know, the Indian landlords do not pay their bills, and the government doesn't force them to. So how can we make something like that work in this situation?
Good evening. My name is Dominic. I'm a student here at SIPA, and I actually have a question. It concerns the second dimension of the UNDP's work in development, managing global goods. There's been increasing research on regional public goods, and I was wondering if the UNDP works in this area, because so far mainly I know that regional development banks work in this area, and I wondered if the UNDP also has programs, maybe in cooperation with the regional development banks. Thank you.
Do you want to answer the three questions, please?
Yeah, I think so. On the first one, I mean, you know, every organization has to have a governance and a board, and we have a board. The decision, some decisions are taken by the board, and we follow them. But I must say that the hiring practice was really, to me, also not very acceptable anymore. I mean, you know, we should be able to hire people I mean, we do it everywhere in the world, and it's not normal that government should impose a particular person on who works in our office. So I have my own, as a manager, I have my problem with that practice. What I found somewhat, you know, unfair or not right is that this is blown out of all proportion as a huge whatever, you know. I mean, it's an issue, but it's not as if this led to the financing of the nuclear program of North Korea, for example, as was alleged by some. And the fact that it was focused on UNDP while others were doing exactly the same. So, you know, if this is such a big problem, why focus just on UNDP? But I mean, there are some, you know, like so many situations in life, things are not completely either or. One reaches certain limits beyond which the behavior of a government becomes a real problem. And the international community then says, wait a minute, you know, this I don't think necessarily violates neutrality. Neutrality doesn't mean that the international community and its governance structures have to accept any kind of behavior. Okay? So, you know, sovereignty, as I said, sovereignty is the constituent of our governance system, but I think it has limits. And again, I mean, I'm sure you discussed the right to protect, the duty to protect, and all these kinds of things. At some point, there are certain international values and humanity's common values which, you know, which transcend sovereignty. And I'm not saying that this was necessarily reached in the North Korean case, but all I'm saying is that, you know, there are legitimate moments when an international board makes some decisions which reflect kind of broad consensus in the international community. The question on the financing, well, I mean, you know, the problem is in a country where there is still extreme poverty, one has to have projects which are affordable, you know, and of course, that is one of the big challenges. Electricity losses, either to technical reasons or to economic reasons, are very widespread. And the big challenge is to have electricity at a price that can actually be afforded by very poor people, or have alternative arrangements. I mean, I visited a biomass-based rural generator project, which in particular areas can be very useful. There's no way that the consumers in very poor countries are going to be able themselves, without any help, to pay for expensive new clean energy technology. Okay, so that's why I'm saying there have to be international financing mechanism. I can't go into the details today, but that help these countries be clean, but at the same time make energy affordable. And the final question was on regional public goods. Yes, there are some goods that are global public goods, others are more regional in nature, and we have to, they basically bring with them the same kind of challenges. In other words, whether it's a global level or the regional level, they require a cooperation between sovereign states to be made available. So we apply the same kind of principles and support at the regional level than at the global level. Although we concentrate more on the global level by nature of our global mandate, whereas regional organizations, just such as regional development banks or economic commission, regional commissions for Africa, Asia, and so on, Latin America, deal more with the regional issue. I think we have another 6-7 minutes, then I have to catch a plane.
So be quick.
I'm actually going to Geneva to a meeting with resident coordinators, to particularly be interesting to Life was your name? Yeah. On with the Human Rights Commissioner on UNDP and human rights. So that's where I'm heading for tomorrow. Yeah,
Hi,
very quickly because.
Sure. My name's Abhinav, and I'm a second-year student studying economic and political development. And my question relates to the World Bank. It being the largest multilateral financier of development projects, do you find that the UNDP's voice or power as an agent of development diminished in view of that? And does that create tensions with the World Bank? Or what some of those tensions are, and how can they be mitigated?
Okay.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Alana. I'm from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. I'm just wondering, you talked a lot about individual kind of countries' contribution towards the United Nations.
Can you speak a bit louder?
And I'm just wondering about the extent to which individual countries' foreign policy clashes with their institutional obligations towards the United Nations in the Security Council in particular.
Hello, I'm Adriana. I'm a student here at SIPA, and my question relates to the Global Compact and how the UNDP is engaging with private companies, multinational corporations.
Last question.
Tikus Javits, and I'm a student of sustainable development. My question is very fast. In the light of climate change and other things, what will it take for UNDP to change its name to UN Sustainable Development Program, just to reflect all of that and actually do something about it?
All right, I have to be very quick, so please forgive me if I'm not, in responding in detail. Regarding the World Bank, of course, I've been at the World Bank myself for many years. I have appreciated my years there. It's a great institution. I do believe it's closer to the financing side and not as close to the governance and the grassroots side, but there are many complementarities. I also fundamentally believe that some competition is actually good. I'm not a market fundamentalist, mind you. But I do believe that even in public affairs, there's some competition is not so bad. And, if the World Bank was the only actor in development, it would be really almost like a total monopolist, okay? If the UN was the only family active in development, then in a way the UN development agencies as a whole would be very dominant, or would be kind of a little bit like a monopolist. So the fact that there is the World Bank group, and that the fact that there is the United Nations Development Group, and that sometimes we try to show each other that we're actually doing something better than the other one, may not be such a bad thing. For example, our Human Development Report now, I say our, because I'm at UN, of course, you know, we now have the view that, oh, our human development report has to be the best. It has to be better than the World Bank's World Development Report, you know. And I think, frankly, this year's UNDP Climate Change and Development was excellent. And Bob Zoellick congratulated me and kind of said this, you know, we launched it together actually in Washington. So I think some competition is good, but then when it comes to the actual reporting requirements for countries, the kind of the bureaucratic requirements we put, the timing issues on, you know, poverty reduction strategies, there we have to cooperate. We cannot kind of impose kind of additional burdens on countries. So competition sometimes in the quality of our products, competition sometimes in some of our policy advice, yes, but cooperation when it comes to the bureaucratic side of things and you know, the kind of impositions we put on countries. Global Compact, very briefly, is something the UNDP supports but works also with the Secretary General. It's a huge success. The number of private companies that are signing up to certain standards of behavior and that are kind of encouraged to do this in the UN framework is very large. And I think it's a great development. It's not philanthropy. I mean, that's a different side. It's not what private companies themselves want to do, but it's the code of conduct. And in that sense, I think it's one of the best initiatives we've had. The final question, the kind of when are we going to be the United Nations Sustainable Development Program? I think in our strategic plan, we very clearly say that. And in many ways, you know, the kind of three big ideas, the poverty reduction, sustainability, environment, and fighting global climate change, and human empowerment as part of the democratic governance practice, are intimately linked. I really think these three dimensions must be seen as a whole. And in that sense, I fully agree. You know, sustainable human development, I would say, and not just sustainable development, because the human part brings in the human empowerment, the gender aspects, you know, the kind of democratic aspects, democracy defined not in a legalistic sense, but in a participation in the development process sense. Having said that, however, changing the name of a UN organization, you know, I tried to change my title. I didn't like the administrator. It sounds like, you know, I'm there sitting with pieces of paper, which I am actually, but you know, soon I realized it was a lost cause, so I've accepted the administrator. So while I think in substance we should be doing that, I think the name change is probably not very feasible, let's put it this way, because then somebody will say and add another 2 or 3 things. The next thing we know, we'll have a name with like 15 terms in it. And so I think at this point we'll stick to development, but with the understanding that it's about human sustainable development. Let me end with that.
Well.